We didn't miss much. We had a short class because we had a thing going on. Yeah, extra long church meeting thing going on.
Gotta maybe open the door and stand outside and make this one.
I know. Tammy complained that she couldn't read the blue. I'll try this blue and see if it works. Well, it works pretty good. It's look, I was flying yesterday, so I left the same words in, and we were covering the same kind of stuff anyway. But in Greek, this sound is hodos. This is hodos. So, King hodos, hodos, the way.
Not a hobo.
Maybe that's where the word came from.
Well,
Hodo. Anyway, the way. This is Mark's continual call, the way, and we even see more of it. I just can't leave this word alone. I've just got to keep reminding you. Pistis meaning to be convinced. Pisteo, to have been convinced. One is a noun, one is a verb. Remember, those who were not believers were called apistis. Not convinced. And really, historical theology. In historical theology, if you call somebody a believer or a non-believer, you're in the Muslim world, right? Let's kill the non-believers, and the believers are those who are selected. On the other hand, if you're convinced or not convinced,
There's hope for you.
yeah, I can't imagine a jihad against those who aren't convinced. Can you imagine that? We'll go after those who are not convinced. Well, what does that mean? We'll go convince them, right? I don't know. It just, the resonance to the gospel, to me, in Greek especially, is so powerful. And yet, what we have kind of made it is kind of scary, right? As a matter of fact, it's scary in another way, because what does the rest of the world do with that?
See it as a sign of weakness?
Well, equivalence, right? What's the difference between Christianity and Islam? There isn't any, right? In that worldview, right? If it's a question of being convinced of truth, right, or believe. If I say to you, if you believe, what do you want me to believe, right? In Islam, you believe a certain set structure of ideas. In Hinduism, you believe a certain set structure of ideas. I can't prove Islam. I can't prove Hindu.
I've got a book. Must be They've got a gun.
I've got a gun, yeah, and you'll be.
They've got the gun. We've got the logic. They've got the guns.
And of course, well, that then becomes the Hunger Games and the Insurgent, right? Hunger Game and Insurgent, right? Dystopian, so I can put people down until they rise up, and then when they rise up, they have guns too. Well, maybe, right? Depends on how effective your cultural squishing is. And by the way, remember this: no people who are ever repressed. People who are repressed don't have revolutions.
They don't have guns.
People who are repressed don't have revolutions.
It's a degree, isn't it? Eventually they have a revolution, they've been repressed a little bit.
We've been taught wrongly that what happens is that, for example, this is what we've been taught. We've been taught that as you repress people and you repress people and repress people, they get angrier and angrier and angrier, and they get better and better, and then they revolt, right? That's what we've been taught. Okay, what happened in the American Revolution? What were
Taxes.
We had a number of freedoms already, yeah. Didn't spring from total repression.
actually, what were the British doing at that time? Do you know what they're doing? King George was relieving the repression on the American colonies because he was afraid they would revolt. So, for example, that he was relieving some of the taxes. He was relieving some of the stuff. But that caused the issue, the political issue was they are affecting our taxes without our representation, right? Whether they're getting less or more. And they changed their taxing source too.
Yeah, but then they tax tea, and that was.
They moved the taxes for the tea from one place to another
Yeah.
for the intent of gaining more tax dollars and also of reducing the burden of taxes on the East India Company,
Okay.
which would have put more money in the pockets of Americans. I'm just saying, we have been taught that the more repression you get, and then people get to a boiling point. What happened in the French Revolution? You know what's happening then, right? They had the greatest freedom they'd ever had at the point of the French Revolution because King Louis XIV was reducing the burden on the people. However, even though he was reducing taxes, what was the real problem? The profligate spending of the court and the
She
queen.
said, let them eat cake.
Well, Perestroika was kind of another example. He kind of got away from the Soviet Union.
Perestroika, the Glasnost. Remember Glasnost and Perestroika? What was happening? The Soviet Union was finding that they were trying to give more and more freedom to the people because the people were getting more and more of the Western knowledge through their news media, and so they were reducing the restrictions on the people. What you find in every human revolution is almost always, inevitably, you have repression that is suddenly, in some degree, lifted. And they get more freedom. And when they begin to taste more freedom, that's when you start to have problems. In societies that continue repression, you don't see revolution. So, for example, the 1917 revolution in Russia. What was happening just before that revolution? Do you remember?
Well, you got rid of the Tsar.
The Tsar had changed to a parliamentary system and stepped down. And so the parliamentary system, they were gaining more freedoms. The serfs were gaining more freedoms than ever in the Soviet Union. And then you had it come up. Then you had the revolution. So the best way to keep people down is to continue to repress them. And that will work every time. So, you know, whether it's an abject lesson of ideas or thoughts, if you want to control people, you keep repressing them. And you keep taking you want to take their weapons. You definitely want to take their weapons. That's what you always do. That's how you control societies. That's how the Roman legion controlled and the Romans controlled. And not what just the Romans. All of them did it. Right? And I love my example. My favorite example is Samson. Why did Samson use a jawbone of an ass? Because it's all he had. Poor guy. So he used a jawbone of an ass to kill a bunch of guys. You know, it's because there was no metal. They took the metal from him. So I'm just, you know, in our thinking, right, we've been taught certain things, and I'm just saying, when we unwrap the history, everybody wants to believe that they were oppressed and then they got mad and they, but what they failed to mention was that usually it was coming up. So how does that fit within the question of pistis and apistis? Like I said, you know, a question of belief is like, you know, jingoism, right? A question of convincing is a logical response. And I think, well, this is what we see about Jesus, right? Sarx, suke, pneuma. I guarantee you're not going to hear a lot about pneuma in the Old Testament or in the New Testament letters or anywhere. The pneuma is. It exists. And the sarx is. It exists. What do we hear about all the time? Suke, not feelings. The mind, thinking. Yeah, yeah. Jesus and Paul and all those guys, their answer to the problems of the world is thinking. No, it's not education. It's not what you know.
Education.
It's thinking. You see, I think we do a lot too little thinking, right? We're all well educated within the culture, within our culture, right? We're educated. But how much time do you spend thinking? And you know, I think that if Jesus were here, and back knowing from what he talks about, you know, we translate the word all the time as soul or, you know, life or this or that, right? But in Greek it's suke. Over and over again, suke, 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 suke. And in English we want to mix it up. As a matter of fact, I think I mentioned last week, the big mix-up that we're getting to is something that really worries me in the church. Because in the church we want to talk a lot about your soul and a lot less about your flesh. That's okay, you know. Everybody has desires, everybody's sinning, right? But we don't want to talk about not doing that. But what we hear a lot too little about, in my opinion, today is about thinking thoughts. Right? Is your soul all right? Well, Jesus would say, if your soul isn't all right, what do you need to start doing? Thinking. Applying your mind to the right stuff. And that's through the whole of the Greek in the Gospels. That's what it's about. And so we'll see more of that. This other word is just, it's E-L-A-B-E-T-E here, but it's lambano. That's what it's pronounced, lambano. Ilamete, lambano. And what it means is to take. To take. And I do not know why we have, well, I know historically why we have taken this word, take, and turned it into receive. But the word means to take. And I'll point it out when we get there, when we see it. It's quite common. It's a very common Greek word. So
it's better to take than to receive. If we're going to flip it around, we might as well do the whole thing.
well, this isn't in that. That's not within this context.
True, but if we're going to flip it, we might as well be consistent.
It's just that this is a very interesting word. Lambano, whole theologies have been developed based on this word and its mistranslation. Just so you know. We are kind of at 10 and 11, 11:10. And the point is this, and I'll reset it a little bit. I'm not going to go into huge, enormous depth. But remember, Jesus is coming up. Now, today we had this. This is the reading from Mark. So Jesus is coming up from the Jordan through Jericho and to Jerusalem. And remember I told you there is a serious problem here. What we have seen in Mark is this marvelous thing because we have this Jesus guy, and this Jesus guy basically through the whole front of Mark produces all kinds of miracles that through the first half of Mark up to 8 leads us to believe that he is God. Except Mark gives us this beautiful, I'm not going to say revelation. Mark gives us the revelation through Peter's words, but Peter misgot it, right? Because Peter couldn't say that, hey, Jesus, you're God, when Jesus said, who am I? He said, you are the Christus. And Jesus said at that point, this first time he ever said it, he said, the Son of Man. Son of Man, which is a code word in the Apocrypha and in the Old Testament, but specifically in the Apocrypha, for the Christus. The problem with this idea of Son of Man and Christus is, Christus means anointed. Christus is the anointed. And the anointed is either your king or your priest, high priest, your priest, or your prophet. Now, which one do you think Mark means?
All three.
Yes.
Yes! Good answer. I like that, right? It means all of it. But you notice Jesus puts it into more, let's say, politically correct terms and says Son of Man. Because if you go around saying Christus, what's going to happen to you?
Which brings me to the question is, if they started to call them Christians, then they're calling them the anointed. Instead of the Tein Hodos, we're now calling them the anointed.
Well, There is a very, okay, remember, okay, I'll go down that track because this is a really interesting point that no one has brought up before, but it is a beautiful fit. So it says in Acts that they first started calling Christians in Antioch. Antioch is a Greek city, right? And we know, I've told you this before, but I'll do it again just for the benefit because it's beautiful. In a mysterion, mysterions are always named for their god or their leader. Therefore, the Osirian mysterion is named after Osiris. The Pythagorean mysterion is named after Pythagoras. There is no Socratic mysterion, I think, but the Platonic, there's a Platonic mysterion named after Plato, right? The Epicurean mysterion, which is the guys that ate and had a good time. No, I'm not sure they exactly did that, but the Epicureans was named after Epicurus. The Mithrin mysterion, named after Mithras, their god. So you always named it after your god or your leader.
And Paul shut them down. The
What?
Pauline. Saul, Paul.
Pauline.
He
Yeah.
shut them down on that.
There could have been, remember, as a matter of fact, you probably heard of Paulianism or Pauline, right? That would be a mysterion. And they did. They tried to, there was a tacit attempt at a mysterion based on Paul, but died very early. But that's almost immaterial, but it was, because remember, you named them after your leaders or your gods. And so at Antioch, even though the Christians called themselves the Way, Tin Hodos. Matter of fact, we know that because in Acts it says they were called Tin Hodos. Over and over again in the Gospels and in Mark, it's called, Christians call themselves Tin Hodos. But the Greeks called them Christians because it was based on the name of the leader and the god. But there is another aspect that it means the anointed. And there's a very important point about that. Because what did Christians do that was not necessarily completely unusual, but it was unusual. It was unusual to Mysterians. Not completely unusual, but unusual.
They told their secret.
No, almost all Mysterians baptized. Almost all Mysterians had, all the rites of Christianity are almost all Mysterian rites, except one. What do we do when we baptize? The pastor takes oil and he anoints. And I should do a class on Orthodoxy because Orthodoxy is really cool. In Orthodoxy, they did it on the forehead, on the back, and on the back of the spine. They did it in multiple places. They did it on the wrists. So in Christianity, we know from the very early parts of Christianity, they anointed those they baptized. When you anoint people, you are anointing, and they also anointed them for healing, right? Remember that? Right? And so, who do you anoint?
Prophet, priest, or king.
Prophet, priest, and king. So why were Christians anointing their members? This is something that I think we really miss. In the baptism, right? The mikvah. The mikvah is supposed to make you like
Sinless.
Jesus. You're supposed to die like Jesus in the tomb, right? The symbol of baptism is that you are buried, you die, and then you're raised again, right? So to make you like Jesus, what do I have to do? I have to anoint you, right? You have to be anointed. Because in the idea of the mysterion, and also the idea of early Christianity, you are what with Christ? You're an heir. You're an heir of Christ, right? You are like a son of God. Look, we miss this whole point. The whole idea of the Mysterian concept, the whole idea of not just Mysterian, of early Christianity, is, remember what Paul said? Is there, in Christianity, is there female? Is there male? Is there free? Is there slave? All are ecclesia. Ecclesia. That's why they call themselves the ecclesia. The Orthodox Church still calls itself the ecclesia. For some reason we call ourselves kurios, church, right? The ecclesia is the Greek Athenian democracy. Everyone is equal in the idea of Christianity. And so therefore we are equal heirs with Christ. Didn't Christ say that? Didn't Paul say that? Right? So therefore, to make you an equal heir with Christ, I have to anoint you. I make you like Christ. And then I bury, Mary, it goes even deeper than that because, okay, and now we're talking a little theology here. I wish Steve was here because Steve would like this. This is historical theology, right? In historical theology, you die with Christ, and therefore you take on the likeness of Christ. This is a whole Mysterian idea. In other words, you take on the presence of the deity, and you die symbolically with the deity. And then guess what you can do after that? You then participate in the rituals of the deity, which is like the meal. We're talking Mysterian ideas. But you notice how this fits hand in glove with the Christianity, the ideas of Jewish Christianity, right? This is why Paul took the ideas of Jewish Christianity and turned them into Mysterian ideas. Because when the Greeks heard them, they went, I understand this. This makes sense to me. I am pistis. I am pisteo. I'm convinced. And with that, you had, of course, the thing we're going toward, the climax of all the Gospels, that Jesus keeps telling them is going to happen. Death and resurrection. But the problem we have at this very moment is this guy who was blind, what a beautiful Greek irony, the blind man asked Jesus to let him look up at the heavens. In other words, see the kingdom of God. And Jesus said, and healed him. And the man called him the Son of David. Therefore called him king. Now, how is Jesus going to get out of this? Then the people started saying the Hallel. So they're going up to Jerusalem singing the Hallel, which precludes the coming of the Son of Man, the Christus, who, by the way, in Jewish thought, is also the king. So I have a double, triple problem here. And it says in 11, Jesus entered Jerusalem and went to the temple. Now, it didn't say which gate he entered, but I bet he entered the back gate, the temple gate, because that's where he was coming from. He came through the pilgrim gate, sometimes called. He went to the temple. He looked around at everything, but since it was already opsios, sunset, you notice it says already late. The Greek said it was sunset. He went out to Bethany with the 12. Why is it important that it is sunset?
Because that's when the Jewish day begins.
That is when the Jewish day begins, but what happens in the temple at sunset? Well, nothing happens in the temple at sunset because you have to do all the sacrifices during the daylight. So the point, see, I really don't like the fact that they said, if they told us it was past sunset, then we would get, we as readers could get the point. Every Greek person reading this, and every Jewish person reading this, when it says it was sunset, they know. Remember, why couldn't they do the Passover sacrifice in the temple remember when there was the heavens darkened, when Jesus was put to death, right? And if you read Centurion, you'll see it says, in Centurion I tell you flat out, but in the Gospels it doesn't tell you flat out. It's just we know that it's written in the histories they could not do the sacrifice because it was dark.
Can't do work on Sunday either.
They knew that, well, you can for this, because you can, that was one of Jesus' points. Remember, the Talmud allows the priest to do stuff on the Shabbat that is required for worship, so they can sacrifice. Sacrifice is not considered work in that sense. But the big deal is that they could not do the sacrifice because it was dark. You cannot do the sacrifice before sunrise, and you cannot do the sacrifice after sunset. So therefore, the purpose of the temple is sacrifice. There is no other purpose in the temple. It is not a place of prayers per se. But we're going to see something very interesting here. So anyway, because, and by the way, because it's sunset, what can Jesus do in the temple?
Nothing.
Nothing. Right, because it's past, we could say it's past the hours of work.
People begin to go home.
Well, not only people go home, but there's nothing in there, right?
But if you're going to preach, why preach to an empty temple?
Well, you don't usually preach in the temple, but we'll see what happens here. This is interesting stuff. Jesus comes as king. He enters the temple. There's an irony here, too. He entered the temple. He came as king, and he entered the temple. Remember, he came into the city riding on a colt, right?
The priest goes in the temple, not the king.
Well,
Necessarily.
no. The king can go in the temple if he's Jewish. But what about Herod? Can Herod enter the temple? Herod cannot legally enter the temple because he is, remember? He's Enidine. That's right, Edomite. He cannot enter the temple. He married to the 10th generation, so he can't enter the temple. How about the Gentiles? Can they enter the temple? Nope. Can the Greeks or Romans? Unless they're Jewish, they cannot enter the temple. Jesus entered the temple. This is a huge thing. So he enters a king, goes into the temple at sunset. Now, there's another reason why it's good that he went at sunset. Why do you think? Why would Jesus enter the temple at sunset? It wasn't that he mistimed.
They blew the horn. How can you miss time?
Well, it's dark. How can you mistime it? The point is, why would he go at sunset? When do kings enter their realm? If you're a king, when do you want to come? Don't come in the morning, people are asleep. Don't come at night because people aren't there, nobody's working, right? They're all going home. You come in the middle of the day when the sun is bright, at 12 o'clock, and you come right in, and you ride in. Jesus is intentionally, preventing, subjugating. He's also, do you remember the last big fight they had? The last big fight was the disciples. And remember, we conveniently like to forget all the stuff that happened before. Everything that happened before is critical to what's happening now, right? And so the last big fight was the one that we heard in the sermon today. The disciples said, hey, I want on your right and I want on your left when you come into your kingdom, right? And Jesus just did what? He came into his kingdom, right? So the big fight was about that, but this Jesus came in at sunset, riding on a colt, through the back door. See? He is diffusing the situation, and he did it pretty well. He did it pretty well, according to Mark. And this makes sense, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
if it was to happen the way it did, otherwise it would have happened beforehand if you would have instigated.
Well, in America,
Walking in there 4 in the afternoon.
and by the way, what do you know? When did he enter the city gates? You have to know this. Of course, this is cultural, but there is okay. Let me see how I can do this. Draw a time. Here's sunset. So, what does a gate imply? A gate implies it is
Open or close?
open or closed. When do they shut the gates?
Sunset.
They shut the gates before sunset, right?
Don't want to do work on the Sunday.
Well, no, not just that. You shut the gates to keep the bad guys out, right? And you can't check them, and you don't want people attacking, right? So Jesus had to enter the city during the daytime.
Or the side gates.
It doesn't matter. He had to enter. You do not open the city. Okay.
The small gate.
Okay, if somebody comes to the side of your house and says, bangs on your door in the middle of the night and says, let me in, do you let him in? Nope. If they come to the front door, do you let them in? Maybe not. Maybe, right? You turn the lights. I'm just saying, no. You close all the gates of the city, or otherwise it's worthless. Everybody knows this. You guys need to live in a walled city.
Are we talking about the barn door here again?
How come you're not living in a walled city? That's what Jesus would say. No. You know, they all lived in walled cities, so everybody knew what everybody did, right? Open cities are dangerous places to live. Because raiders come and bad guys come and, you know, whatever.
Yeah, why have a
So-
wall if you're gonna open it?
So you have a wall, you close it, so the only people coming in are during the sunrise. So what is really important about this is there is a gate closing time before sunset. And if you're going to come, do you come right at sunset? No, because that's like coming to a restaurant right before they're closing. What do you think they're going to do? They'll ignore you so you'll go away, right? I would. I want to go home. So the guards are going to ignore you. There's no way they're going to let you through. And by the way, if you read Centurion, remember, it's the legions that are guarding the place. Nobody else has weapons. I mean, they may be standing there, but they don't have any weapons, so they can't guard nothing. So they close the gate. So Jesus had to come in while the sun was up, and then he went. And how close is the temple to the gates?
Not too far.
Very close. So remember, he has all these guys behind him. They have a large group of people. It doesn't say how many, but it's probably thousands.
An army.
Right? He has a lot of people coming with him, and he comes into the city. You can't hide it. And they come in before sunset. You can't hide it. But then he diffused it by going to the temple after sunset. And he took a look around. It's interesting he did this in any case. So the next day, at 12, the next day they were leaving Bethany. Jesus was famished. Pineo, famished. Now this is very interesting. Because again, remember, I told you, we don't know exactly when this could be. But if he's famished, it may imply that he is fasting, which means what season might this be? It could be Sukkot. Because remember, in that festival, you stayed in a booth on top of your house and fasted until Yom Kippur, or Rosh Hashanah, till Rosh Hashanah. So he may be fasting for it. We don't know. You usually didn't fast for Pesach, for Passover. So anyway, and seeing in the distance a fig tree, a suke, fig tree, in leaf. So a fig tree is in leaf. So maybe it is Passover, right? Could be. Could be spring, coming into spring. Okay. He went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Now this is really important, because most people completely miss the point of this. This is not a parable. This is an allegory. This is a pure allegory, a Greek allegory. What you have to do is you have to figure out what Mark is telling you in this allegory, because this is an unstated telos, like all Greek, logos to telos. But number one, there are questions on the board. The questions on the board is, Mark has told us basically who Jesus is. Unstated telos, he is God, but it's unstated, right? The question on the board is, who is this guy? That's the question. It has been stated that he is the Christus, and Jesus has said this Son of Man guy, whoever he is coming to die and be resurrected. But he was called a king. The question is, what season is it? Is it the season for a king? The question on the board right now is, he's king, right? But it is not the season for something. So is it the season for kings or the season for Christus? What is the season? What season is it, right?
Bearing fruit or not bearing fruit?
What is the season? And by the way, notice, the fig tree is in leaf, right? But no fruit.
The roads are muddy.
What's that?
The roads are muddy.
And the roads are muddy, right? The roads are muddy. So likely this is the spring season, so maybe Passover season. I'm just saying. But for some reason, Jesus is really famished. So this is interesting. Then he said to the tree, literally, apokrimo epo. He didn't logically talk to the tree. He said to the tree of his own thinking, may no one ever eat fruit from you again.
That's a curse.
May no one ever eat fruit from you again. All right. What does a fig tree represent? We can figure this out very easily. First of all, Bethany that we're talking about is south of Jerusalem, but pretty close, down the road. Yes, sir.
So he went in the gates, went to the temple, then did he go back outside of the gates?
Yes.
To go to Bethany?
To go to
I
Bethany.
thought the gates were closed.
The next morning,
Likely the next morning. Yeah,
the following day.
the following day. I think. Let's see.
Yeah, it is.
The next day.
Next
Well,
day.
Just said he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with 12.
Yes.
we got back to Bethany somehow.
The impression is that he went into the city. It's after sunset. The gates are closed. They're not going to let you in or out. So he went to Bethany. Bethany's outside the city. The impression is that he spent the night in Jerusalem at some place. Who knows? Travelers. Probably not Travelers Inn, but just stayed, and then went to Bethany. And then the next day, as they were leaving Bethany, so maybe the reason they're hungry is because they just went to Bethany. Now remember, Bethany is important because that's where. Remember who was there? Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And in Mark's gospel, they aren't important to the point, right? So it really doesn't talk about them, but they are in the other gospels, which is really interesting, right? But the
Now,
point.
if I understand, even if you're fasting, you might eat during the evening or night.
That's
not during the day.
That's Islamic.
That's Islam, but it could.
They usually drink water only, and usually did not eat during the day. That's
definitely Islamic, but then again, there's a lot of ththings that could also have been at that time.
I don't know. I'm not gonna buy that too much because remember what they said about fasting. Don't. Remember Jesus even said, don't make a face. Because really had gaunt faces, and when they're fasting, they were really fasting. I mean, they drank only water usually, and of course, drinking water in that time was probably a bad idea anyway. So, little wine is good for it. But in any case, Jerusalem is up here. Jerusalem's up here. That's not a very good picture of the city, but it's something like that. Anyway, Bethany's down here, and likely the best way to get to Bethany is through the garbage gate across the Gehenna and down to Bethany. So, and by the way, Bethany's probably not a place you would go in. And by the way, I should have translated if it says the next day or not, but it could be the next day. But we know from the other Gospels why Jesus went to Bethany, right? But Mark doesn't tell us why he went to Bethany at all. And also, and I should have looked this up because I didn't look this up, because the important thing to mark here is not necessarily the time spent in Bethany. What is important to mark is the fig tree, right? So Jesus saw the fig tree when he came out of Bethany and he's going to Jerusalem. So what do you think the fig tree represents?
Well, what about the cross?
Jewish faith?
Well, I think by extension the Jewish faith, but it specifically represents Jerusalem. It's Jerusalem. That's what the fig tree is. The fig tree is Jerusalem. And because the Jerusalem, okay, remember, all right, the world of city-states. This is a world of city-states, not nations. Right? We think in terms of nations. The world at this time thinks in terms of city-states. So what is the city-state here? Jerusalem, right? That's the city-state. So Jerusalem as a city-state represents what? The Jewish people, the Hebrew people. It represents their king. It represents their temple. It represents their God. It represents everything about them, right? So the fig tree represents what? All of that. The fig tree is all of those things wrapped up in one. And Jesus sees it at a distance. And that's the clue. Because he sees a fig tree at a distance, but what else does he see at a distance?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
It's hard to
Exactly.
miss at that moment.
Exactly. He is at Bethany going toward Jerusalem, and he sees a fig tree at a distance, which the fig tree, you see Jerusalem.
Now, Bethlehem's only about 7 miles south. Bethany's
No,
only a few
Bethany's,
miles
Bethlehem's
south.
over here.
I'm just saying, it's not very far.
No, it's not that far.
And Bethany isn't much, it's even less, as I recall.
And Bethany has a well. Bethany is a big deal because it has a well. It's a traveler route, by the way, and a big road coming through there. But in any case,
Now, Bethany would be in Judah, the tribe of Judah.
Bethany is in Judah anyway, in Judea.
Judea, I'm sorry. So
But
it's
Judah,
just
yeah.
barely across the line.
No, Jerusalem's in Judea too.
I thought it was just barely off the line,
No, I
into Benjamin. Maybe,
well,
irrelevant.
I think it's irrelevant. The point is they're all in Judea. They're in Judea, Palestine is controlled by the Roman Empire.
Yeah, but Bethlehem is Jesus' hometown, relatives, friends, but he's in Bethany.
I don't.
It just seems strange, so there's more going on here. Why don't you go visit your relatives and
Well, remember, Mark's purpose, just like the other Gospels' purpose, is not to be in English. In English, we want to know every fact there is,
I
right?
agree, but there's a reason for everything he
Well,
does.
there is a reason, but there's even more than that. Why would Mark not need to tell you about Bethany?
The only thing, it brings up the subject of
Between Jericho and Jerusalem, so you're gonna go through it perhaps, I don't know.
Well, no, because remember, when Mark was doing this, Mark wrote this. I think Mark wrote this at least before 60 A.D. I think it was before 60. It may have been 50 A.D. That's when we get Mark. Mark is the earliest gospel, and probably the point is this: why did Mark wrote down the gospel to tell whom?
Greeks and Romans.
Greeks and Romans, because he was in Rome, most likely. He was in the city-state of Rome in the peninsula of the Italian peninsula. And so he wanted to communicate this as a cohesive Greek logos to telos to those people. So that means that what did they already know about Jesus?
They knew he's from Judea. I mean, that they knew a lot of things about him.
Exactly, precisely. They knew a lot because, I don't know, maybe we've lost the miracle of Marvel because we have movies and TV and books everywhere, right? But when they heard this, when Peter and Mark and the other disciples and others who went, and Paul, went to these people and told them, there's this guy who died. And they'd heard this. They'd heard the rumors. This guy died and resurrected, right? There are rumors everywhere. And they come to him and say, there's this Jesus guy who died and was resurrected. Well, what do you want to know? Everything, right? Because at first you don't believe. You hear this and you go, well, I can't believe that. That's just, some tale, right? But then as they fill you in, they say, well, he was born here. And he had a mother, and his father did this, and he went here, and he was at the temple, and you hear these, and his friends were Mary and Martha, right, and Lazarus, and Lazarus was raised from the dead, right? And you hear all these stories, and where did it happen? It happened in Bethany, right? And there may have been even more histories about Jesus in Bethany. There may have been 100 stories about Jesus in Bethany, right? And so I don't, as Mark, I don't need to tell you about everything that happened in Bethany because that's my point. But when the minute I say to you Bethany and Jesus, you've heard these stories, you've heard about this stuff, right? And you go, yeah. And you've asked, where's Bethany? Well, you know where it is. And people today, we pull out our iPhones, and our iPhones tell us exactly where to drive. But there was a time, I remember, when we had maps. And before that, before you had maps, you said, well, how do I get to the Walmart, right? And someone would tell you the streets and how to get there. And in the past, people would say, well, walk for, you know, a couple of miles to the north, and you'll see a house out on the prairie, and that's where the store is, right? Well, just think these people being described where these things are. So they know, when Mark writes in it, the next day they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was famished, and seeing in the distance a fig tree, so they know, what does he see in the distance? Jerusalem.
That area is noted for its olive trees rather than its fig trees.
Well, I don't know about that. But anyway, there's figs there. But unfortunately, there's no fruits there. And he said to the tree, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. May no one ever eat fruit from you again. Now this is very important, because Jerusalem, the symbol of Jerusalem and eating is what?
The temple.
The temple. Because what do I do in the temple?
Sacrifice.
I sacrifice, and remember, I've got the five sacrifices, and the last sacrifice is the one of praise and thanksgiving that we all share in, which, by the way, became the Eucharist. That's what it is, the sacrifice of prayer and thanksgiving. So anyway, the reason it's a big deal is because what did Jesus just made an announcement of announcement. Did he say anything necessarily? Now, we will get some king stuff in here, but what did he just say?
Temple doesn't work anymore.
No more sacrifice, temple doesn't work anymore. He said it is no longer the season.
A new era.
He just proclaimed the beginning of what? The Messianic era. In the Messianic era, in the Messianic era, according to the Talmud, according to the priests, according to the Sadducees and Pharisees, in the Messianic era, there's no more need for any sacrifice except for the sacrifice of prayer and thanksgiving. Because all the other sacrifices have been taken care of by the Christus. Jesus just said that the Christus is here. He didn't say who he is, but we know he's not king. And by the way, there's an implication here about kingship. But we'll see how that works. Anyway, 15, on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out ekbalo. Okay, the word, I love this word. He ekbaloed them just the same way he ekbaloed the demons from people. The same word, ekbalo, ejected. Driving out is not that great a word. He ejected them. So I guess he took them by the... In any case, those who were buying and selling there. Now, he did not overturn... their tables is probably not a good word. The word is, and benches. It says money changers and the benches. Cathedra. Let's think about this a little bit in terms of culture. Did people sit on stuff? Who sat?
King.
Slaves sat. Slaves in their culture sit on stuff, okay? Now, rulers may sit on thrones, and remember there's some Roman chairs. You ever seen those portable Roman chairs for generals and stuff like that? You might sit on that.
For the director.
But people, okay, we think in terms of the ubiquitous in our culture. We got how many chairs here? A gazillion chairs. How many chairs did you find in the average house? 0. How many chairs are anywhere? 0. Okay? Most likely, now in the Greek, these are a 4-legged stool, a trapeza. And their benches, they are cathedra, all right, of those selling pigeons, not doves, pistera. I don't know why they decided they translated doves instead of pigeons. Maybe because doves seem nicer than pigeons, but they're selling pigeons there. Okay? So who are sitting down? Who are sitting down at cathedra? The down-sit place. Do you think the people are sitting down on something? No. Okay. Are your birds just going to be there? What do you got to do with them?
Put them in a cage.
You got to put them in something, right? You got to put them in a coop. And in a coop, they do what? They sit on As a matter of fact, what they did is they didn't necessarily put coops because they couldn't afford them. They would tie them to a stick, yes, and that is probably what the cathedra is. So what they're probably saying is tables is probably good because what they did is these were guys that were selling, and so when you're selling, okay, what's the big deal? You sit on the ground, right? And you sit on the ground so your feet don't face people, because this is really important in that culture. And where does the money go?
Probably beside you. Or your purse.
Well, you don't want the money. Okay, number one, we have a wrong impression of money. In that era, was money really ubiquitous or rare? It was relatively rare, yeah. A lot of, the people that are wealthy have it, but is it beautiful or ugly?
I always thought gold was kind of pretty.
It's beautiful. These are probably the most beautiful objects in their culture. The most beautiful objects that most people ever see. They're artisan pieces. They're stamped gold and silver with beautiful stamps, perfectly stamped. Remember, a lot of times when they stamped them, we think of people just stamping stuff and minting them, and tossing them, right? No, these things were minted and weighed. And remember you talk about weighing? In most of this time, money was weighed because the value was not the money piece per se, but the value of the gold or silver in it, as well as the beautiful object that it was. And so what people did in those days, you ever heard of clipping? They would clip the bits off, and so almost everything was weighed. Did you have
Just a question. If this was, I didn't know if it was the case, under Roman control, would it have been Roman currency?
Not in
Or-
the temple.
Not in the temple.
Okay.
Not in the temple.
It had to be temple money.
As a matter of fact, yeah, it was temple currency, and
Plus the changers, and they could be a little bit off on their weights.
now there were issues with temple currency, and in Centurion I give you lots of examples of the thing because the Greek and the Roman currency was the main currency used by everyone except for the Pharisees. Pharisees would not touch it. They had a special market in the south part of the city, or was it the north part of the city? Anyway, it was the south part of the city. They had a special market that was near the palace of Herod, the palace that was down there, and that's where they would exchange temple money and also in the temple. And remember, there was the average person, if they had anything, had leptons. Remember a lepton? That was the widow's mite. And the lepton was not official temple currency, and it was made out of iron. And that's why, iron was the least valuable of all the stuff, but it was very valuable in itself. So a lepton was, you could buy bread with a lepton, right? And again, that's why the widow's mite was so important, because you could hear it when she put it into the trumpet. A trumpet is a money box that has an open part so people can't steal money by putting their hand down in it. And so the trumpet would make a sound. They were made out of metal, probably brass. And so when you put something like iron in it, they go clunk, clunk, clunk. But when you put silver in it, or silver or gold, they would go cling, 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 cling. Sound really cool. And so that's why the rich guys would come in, and our impression is they would take their money. They probably didn't have this much money, but our impression is they took the money buckets and did it. No, they do it like the kid does it on those roundy things that, they would take every penny or everything they were giving and go, and they'd make sure it was good money, probably clipped, but good money, right? But see, because money was clipped and because it was silver and gold, you wanted to have a little table, well, at least where you had the money, you set it out because it was a valuable commodity and it was beautiful. Our impression is people would keep it in there, but this is a relatively, there's not, thievery exists, but you'd be an idiot. Okay, if there's money standing there, you'd be an idiot to go and just grab it, because what's going to happen to you?
Take your hand off.
Yeah, they'll take your hand off or kill you or something, because everybody's there watching for that, right? So, and it's a temple. And what is going to happen in a temple? You start stealing stuff. You're in big trouble with the ecclesiastical authorities and with the Romans and with the merchants. So anyway, you might end up as a sacrifice yourself. So they would have a table, and the money was beautiful. So the money would be put out. And that also showed that you could make change. You see? I can make change. See? It's kind of, today we assume everybody has change, but, if money is not ubiquitous, can you make change? It's kind of like me. You ask me, hey, can I change for a $100 bill? Well, maybe. You know what I'm saying? So they would put out their money so you could tell they could make change. And of course, they would keep denominations so that it was possible to do that. There was also the money changers. I think it may mention this here, it may not, it's in the other ones. But money changers, because you had to convert the money you had into temple funds for buying and selling, and also for paying the fines or paying the money for the temple, right? And also there was another gig going that was really bad. Because remember, I came from other areas of Jerusalem or Judea or Israel, right? And Israel didn't exist, but of Palestine, of northern Palestine, of the Galil. And I would bring money like Roman and Greek money, right? Usually Greek money, denarius. And that I would take that money to give my tithe, which became the sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving. That's where the tithe went. So I would take my tithe not to the temple, but the tithe would go to the temple for me to buy food. See? So I would come to Jerusalem and I would take my money and I would have to have it converted at high rates of exchange to the temple money,
Official exchange.
to the official money, and then I would have to take that money and buy the sacrificial grain and meat, right? And so I have a double conundrum here. And Jesus is at the temple about to do something that he's not going to regret, but other people may regret. But as you read this, think in terms of this very important idea. What does it mean? What does the fig tree mean in the context of the curse of the fig tree? Because this is the key to the entry into Jerusalem, and one of the whole key points in Mark's gospel that runs into the climax. We like to try to, it's just some parable, right? But it has deep meaning, and that's why it's so hard to understand. So in any case, thank you, Father, for bringing us here safely. Thank you for your word. Thank you for bringing Judy back and helping her be safe. Look after us all. We pray these things in your Son's blessed and holy name. Amen.